January 28th, 2026, 10:15 in the morning. A New York State Supreme Court judge brings his gavel down, and in that instant, the shield around Donald Trump's business empire cracks. For years, he looked untouchable. Lawsuits came and went, investigations flared and faded. Penalties loomed and then disappeared in a fog of appeals and political theater. But this time, it's different. This time, a single legal decision puts his towers, his golf courses, his cash flow, his brand under direct threat of seizure to satisfy a massive civil fraud judgment that has been hanging over him like a storm cloud. 17 days. That's all he had to fix a problem he didn't think could happen. 17 days after a Japanese-linked financial firm quietly pulled out, spooked by global bond market chaos. 17 days to replace a shattered $464 million appeal bond that had been the thin line between his empire and New York's enforcement machine. He watched the phones go quiet. Watched the same Wall Street that once tripped over itself to lend him money now step back. Watched the clock run out on a deadline that no judge was willing to move. Donald J. Trump, not just a businessman, but the sitting president of the United States, now staring down the very real possibility that state authorities can walk in and start taking control of his private empire while he is still in the Oval Office. So, how did it come to this? And why does what happened on January 28th matter far more than just one man's fortune? Because what you're about to hear changes how power, law, and money collide in America. For decades, Trump's image was simple: the mogul who always bounced back, towering skyscrapers, glittering casinos, the gold-plated penthouse above Fifth Avenue, Mar-a-Lago, the Florida Palace. His name on buildings from New York to Dubai. Banks chased him, insurers cut deals, politicians took his calls. He built his brand on one core idea: he always wins. Even when he loses, he spins it into something bigger, louder, more profitable. If you're watching this, you already know he didn't just become president once. He did it again. Re-elected in 2024, back in the White House, signing orders, cutting budgets, fighting the same media he's been at war with for years. But behind the podium, behind the rallies, there was another battle brewing, the one in New York. New York Attorney General Letitia James filed a massive civil fraud case, accusing Trump and the Trump Organization of systematically inflating the value of his properties to get better loans and insurance deals, overstating square footage, claiming sky-high valuations for golf courses and towers that no independent appraiser would recognize. In 2024, Judge Arthur Engoron found him liable for persistent fraud, slapping him with a penalty that, with interest, swelled to the staggering figure of roughly $454 to $464 million. At first, Trump did what he always does. He appealed. He attacked. He went to the cameras and called it a witch hunt, a political hit job cooked up by Democrats in Manhattan. And for a while, it seemed to work. In March 2024, an appeals court cut his bond requirement from the full amount down to $175 million, a number his team scrambled and finally managed to post in time. That bond stopped New York from freezing bank accounts or seizing buildings while the appeals played out. To his supporters, it looked like another Houdini act, another escape. But bonds aren't magic, they're contracts. They depend on real collateral and real confidence. And this is where the story pivots. The $175 million bond that bought Trump time was backed by an insurer tied into global financial markets. On paper, it was solid. In reality, it was sitting on a fault line. In early January 2026, bond market turmoil in Japan triggered emergency margin calls and forced de-risking. Behind closed doors, the financial firm that had stepped up for Trump watched its own balance sheet strain. Regulators and internal risk committees started asking hard questions. By the time the dust settled, the firm made a brutal call. They notified the New York court they could no longer secure Trump's judgment. The bond had to go. That's the file that changed everything. That withdrawal letter, that one document turned Trump from protected appellant back into exposed judgment debtor. Under New York law, once a bond disappears and isn't replaced within a tight court deadline, the state can move immediately to enforce the judgment. No more waiting for final appeals. No more pause. On January 28, 2026, With the grace period gone and no replacement in hand, the judge authorized the immediate execution of the civil fraud judgment. That meant New York authorities could begin seizure steps against Trump's marquee assets to satisfy the hundreds of millions he owes. 40 Wall Street, the commercial portions of Trump Tower, the Seven Springs estate, even bank accounts and aircraft are suddenly in the crosshairs. If you're trying to picture what that looks like in real life, imagine this. Accountants and lawyers dispatched by the state walking through lobbies that once symbolized wealth and control, securing records, mapping income streams. A court-appointed overseer lined up to collect rents, manage the properties, and divert income away from Trump's companies and straight into accounts controlled by New York. Not a hypothetical, not a threat, a process already set in motion by a judge's order. All while Secret Service agents maintain their own perimeter around a man who still holds the nuclear codes. This isn't a random lightning strike. There were warning signs for years. Long before he was president again, lenders and watchdogs whispered about Trump's habit of inflating numbers. Internal documents from the original fraud trial showed valuations tweaked to fit whatever result the Trump organization needed. A triplex apartment in Trump Tower treated as if it were nearly 3 times its actual size. Mar-a-Lago valued as if it were a hyper-luxury private residence, rather than a club restricted by legal covenants and zoning rules. Golf courses assigned sky-high values based on speculative projections rather than actual market data. Bankers were dazzled, as long as the deals made money. But when the political spotlight hit and the Attorney General started pulling threads, the whole web of numbers began to look more like a long-running pattern than a few innocent mistakes. That's the part nobody can afford to ignore, because when a version of this story plays out with a small business or an ordinary homeowner, the outcome is different. Overstate your income on a mortgage application, and you don't get a fine and an appeal. You get denied or prosecuted. For years, Trump seemed to live in a different universe, where consequences arrive slowly, if at all. This January, that universe finally collided with the one the rest of us live in. And it's not just New York closing in. Across policy areas, courts have been hitting Trump's administration with legal defeats, blocking executive orders that undercut clean energy grants to Democratic-led states, allowing offshore wind projects his team tried to stop to move forward, striking down new restrictions on voting registration that judges say only Congress can impose. Taken together, a picture emerges. A president pushing aggressively, and a legal system pushing back again and again. So, on January 28th, when that New York order clears the way for asset seizures, it doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands on top of a pile of nearly 200 ongoing legal battles tied to Trump's agenda, his administration, and his long-tail business conduct. One former federal judge put it bluntly, "We are in uncharted territory, a sitting president fighting to keep state authorities from dismantling his private business empire while he's still in office." If you believe in checks and balances, that sentence should grab you by the throat, because it raises a question no one wanted to answer. Who actually has the power to hold a president's wallet to account? Federal institutions, or the states that nurtured his empire in the first place? Two narratives explode out of this moment. On one side, you've got people saying, finally, accountability. They see a pattern of fraud laid out in court decisions, a mountain of evidence, and a man whose wealth insulated him from the rules everyone else has to follow. For them, New York is doing what regulators and banks should have done long ago: call the bluff and collect. On the other side, you've got millions who see this as proof that the system is rigged against him, and by extension, against them. They look at Letitia James, a Democratic Attorney General, and see politics. They look at the timing, with midterm elections looming in 2026, and see a weapon. They hear seizure of properties and don't think fraud judgment. They think witch hunt. They ask, if a state can do this to a president, what can it do to a regular person who doesn't have any power or platform at all? If you're watching this and you're angry, you're not alone. If you're watching this and you're scared, you're not alone either, because underneath all the headlines about Trump and towers and hundreds of millions of dollars, there's a more personal question. What happens to your trust in the system when you watch it either finally punish someone powerful, or maybe punish them because they're the wrong kind of powerful? When Trump's assets are threatened, jobs are threatened. Workers at his hotels, staff on his golf courses, vendors who depend on contracts with his companies. None of them argued valuations or signed loan documents. They just showed up, worked, and collected paychecks. If his empire is carved up, their lives are collateral damage. A manager at a Trump property once said in an interview about an earlier seizure threat, "If they take this building, what happens to us?" Multiply that question by thousands of people across multiple states. And then there's you. Maybe you don't work for him. Maybe you don't like him at all. But you do live under the same legal system. If you're watching this thinking, he deserves it, ask yourself, do you trust the same tools being used with the same intensity on anyone else who crosses political lines? If you're watching thinking, this proves the system is corrupt, ask yourself, what's the alternative? No enforcement. No accountability at the top at all? Those are the fault lines that January 28th exposes. Meanwhile, Trump isn't just playing defense. He's launching his own legal rockets. On January 29th, he files a monster lawsuit against the IRS and the Treasury Department, seeking at least $10 billion in damages, accusing them of illegally leaking his tax information and waging a politically motivated campaign against him. To his supporters, it's proof he's still fighting back on every front, refusing to let federal agencies define his legacy or his balance sheet. To his critics, it's another attempt to bully watchdogs into silence, to turn the system's scrutiny into a weapon he can frame as persecution. Every new case, every fresh ruling, every emergency hearing feeds into the same spiraling narrative. Either Donald Trump is finally being forced to live in the same legal reality as everyone else, or the institutions meant to protect justice are turning into tools of political vengeance. The truth might be uglier, a system that's inconsistent, reactive, and prone to only really move when the stakes are this high. Remember those 17 days after the bond imploded? 17 days when Trump's team scrambled behind closed doors, calling every insurer they could, chasing every potential guarantor. 17 days when one of the most famous businessmen on earth couldn't find anyone willing, or able, to stand behind nearly $500 million he owed a single state. If you strip away the politics, that alone tells you something about how fragile his empire really was. On January 28th, a judge didn't just enforce a judgment. He tore away the illusion that the Trump organization could simply outweight, outspin, or outfinance consequences forever. And if that can happen to someone with that much visibility, what does that say about the hidden empires we never see? The private equity firms quietly overvaluing assets behind closed doors. The corporations cooking numbers just enough to stay ahead of regulators. If the system took this long to clamp down on one of the most heavily scrutinized figures in American history, what else is it missing? That's the part that should haunt you long after the headlines move on. This isn't just a story about Donald Trump or New York or a single judgment. It's a stress test of American institutions in real time. Can a state hold a sitting president's private business accountable without tearing the country even further apart? Can courts enforce the same rules on the powerful that they would on anyone else, without it being swallowed up by narratives of witch hunt and deep state? Or are we already past the point where any major case like this can be seen as anything but a political weapon? On January 28, 2026, Donald Trump's empire moved one step closer to being carved up to pay a historic fraud bill. The appeals aren't over. The legal fights will drag on. Maybe he finds another lifeline. Maybe a higher court reins things in. But the deeper question isn't what happens to him next. It's what happens to us if the only time the system truly bites is when the cameras are rolling and the country is already divided into two realities that can't agree on what justice even looks like. If you want more breakdowns that cut through the noise and follow the money, the law, and the power, you know what to do. Because this case, this setback, this January 28th moment, it's not the end of the story. It might just be the warning shot.